Welcome to the Sales Leadership Awakening podcast. I'm Stephen Rosen with, as always, my wonderful co-host, Colleen Stanley. Welcome, Colleen.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon.
Afternoon now. In each episode, we try to go as deep as we can to explore the knowing versus doing gap, understanding why leaders and their teams often struggle between knowledge and action.
And today we have a really interesting guest because Jenn Steele, I'm going to let you introduce yourself in a minute, but I want to set it up because usually we feature VPs of sales on this podcast. However, we were introduced to Jenn from a very trusted colleague, and Jenn has this background of IT, sales, and now today marketing. So we're going to have a lively discussion on marketing and sales. So Jenn, welcome in. Would you introduce yourself? Your company is SoundGTM, but tell us a little bit what you do and who you serve.
Of course. So I am CEO and co-founder of SoundGTM. And yes, I did spend most of the last 15 years in marketing and a couple of sales management roles and sales leadership roles. But I think my heart belongs to marketing, which luckily I also trust that same source. Otherwise, I'm not sure I'd be talking to you guys. At SoundGTM, we're trying to build basically the Upwork for B2B pipeline and sales. And a lot of that is to help a lot of, obviously, salespeople both inside organizations, because hey, pipeline and sales, and outside, because as we all know, the go-to-market roles right now are kind of tough, and we have mortgages to pay, or if we're lucky, boats to buy, and our platform brings those two together to try to solve each other's problems.
Oh, I like the way you bring that in there. So Jenn, we all know the age-old story. It's called the blame game, right? So marketing department says, we're providing great leads. The sales department says, no, they're not qualified leads. Marketing says, yes, they are. Your team can't convert them. Sales, and the story goes on and on. So who's to blame? Are they both right? Both wrong? Love your perspective.
Communication's to blame. They've lost trust already if they're playing that game. And it's a tough one because first, if marketing's not listening to sales that they can't convert the leads, maybe they are getting the wrong leads, or maybe the leads are at the wrong level. They're at the wrong stage. Marketing can get better, but sales can get better too. Maybe sales is giving the wrong value prop. Maybe there's been a lack of sales training. I don't think it's both everybody's fault and nobody's fault, if you want to put it that way. If they problem solve together, it is so different than pointing fingers.
It's easier said than done, right? We're in large corporations. You've got a head of sales who wants to do things their way, and you've got a head of marketing who feels, oh my God, sales is not executing. Who's right? How can you better work together?
And I've got a question to go back to what Jenn said. Jenn, you made, if I'm tracking what you shared, marketing may not be listening to sales. And part of that, I think, happens because, in my experience, marketing doesn't do a lot of ride-alongs and listen along with sales. So they might have a value proposition that is stellar, but as you said, wrong level, wrong place, right? And then the sales training. So in your experience, what have you seen marketing directors do to be able to listen better? Because we talk about sales a lot around here, but I'd be curious what you've done, maybe even personally, to be a better listener to the sales team.
I think beyond listening to the sales team, if marketing isn't listening to the customer, they're in very big trouble. One of the best things to do, I found as a marketing leader, was to listen to sales call recording. Not because I wanted to critique the salesperson, although I would learn whether or not is our messaging getting through, or are they just doing a feature dump, what's happening there. And so, yes, I could give feedback, but that's not why I listened. I really listened because I wanted to hear the customer. And bonus points, of course, if it was a marketing had something to do with generating that meeting in some way, because then I could be like, oh my gosh, this is the wrong person. Or I could be like, oh my gosh, this is exactly the right person. Let's get more of them. But it's also like, how are they talking about the problem? How are they talking about the product? How is my sales team hearing this? And so I used to spend Friday afternoons with a cup of tea and my crochet, which is a pandemic hobby, in front of me, listening to Zoom recordings through Chorus Gong, one of those 1.8 speed to save my sanity. But that was one of the best things I could ever do.
So what were some of the tangible impacts that you got from listening into calls and recordings?
Golly, Sometimes it's like, wow, wrong person on the call. And then I'd look for other calls with that job title, because in some organizations, it might be the wrong person. In some organizations, it might be the right person. And so I would form hypotheses. Oh my gosh, this is the perfect person. Let me hear some more calls with this kind of person. Those are the tangible things I could take back to my team and say, hey, let's change our LinkedIn targeting to a different job title.
Got it. And so with the different titles, could there be, in your experience, this industry, this is the title we talk to. In this industry, this is the title we talk to. And so it could be the same product or service offering, but based on the industry, that decision maker or even value prop has to change. Is that correct?
Oh, 1,000%. And not only by industry, but by company side. At one of my companies, when I mapped out personas, I realized that my VP of marketing at a big company had the same stresses as my CMO did at a smaller company. And so it was useful to be able to map those out. But their titles were very different to have the same concerns.
Got it. Interesting.
Let's talk a little bit about communication with your sales counterpart. Are there things you did to open those lines of communication?
Yes. Probably the most memorable was when there was one enterprise sales director I couldn't get to talk to me. And it was like this walled garden. And I'm like, I want to help your team. I don't want to I can't talk to your team. I don't know what's going on. I'm like, what's going on? And so we were having a sales kickoff and we were at the bar and I sat down next to this guy and basically didn't quite match him beer for beer because I would have been in very big trouble if I had. But I'm like, it's not about you need to let me in. It's about can I build a personal relationship? So he's not just like, who is this marketing leader who's being a pain in my backside? He's like, oh, that's Jenn.
That's a good strategy. I sometimes call it breaking bread, but having a few beers is just as effective, maybe even more effective than sitting down for lunch. And I assume that worked.
It made things better. And then every time that it felt like there was tension there, I would take him out to lunch.
The good old quality time fix, which none of us like to do. Jenn, I think we always like to get these big, extreme, complicated solutions. And sometimes it's just slowing down because they don't see you as a person. They don't know that you like to crochet.
All of those things put me together in their brains as a person. Maybe not the sanest person at all times, but at least a person.
So Jenn, you also mentioned, because on a prior call that Steve and I were getting to know you, you also mentioned that you would go into the CRM database. And Steve and I started laughing because our responses were totally different. I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And Stephen, what was your response?
Well, I think that the hair on my back started to rise up. And I guess it all depends how it's done, but certainly I come from a perspective, and I'm sure you come from the opposite perspective, but we always joked in sales that if things worked really well, it was a great marketing program. If they failed, it was poor sales execution. So I guess in many ways, I was a sales leader with a chip on my shoulder, especially at times when it came to marketing.
If you're in blame game environment, if you don't have that relationship with marketing, of course you're going to be like, WTF are you doing in my CRM? And if you haven't talked to me, you don't know that I'm coming from, like, we're all trying to sell product here. And you are the last line. The CRM in most organizations, especially smaller ones, if you don't have a data lake or something, but is the single source of truth. I don't care what my marketing automation platform says. I don't care any of that. I want to go in and pull a report. Like, are my leads getting touched? And not to be like, your reps aren't touching my leads, but like, oh my gosh, why? And I've discovered things like the sales ops changed a workflow and we had no idea. So we were putting the leads into the old workflow and they weren't getting routed. I have discovered things like, oh my gosh, these are horrible leads. Never go to that conference again. I've discovered things like sales team focused on accounts and my team was still throwing singleton leads over the fence. And so they weren't working the leads unless they matched their account list because they didn't have incentive to work on inbounds. Oh, okay, let's learn. This is going to sound horrible. And every marketer listening to this podcast right now is going to hate me. I don't think it's necessarily sales responsibility to figure out why they're not working the leads. I think it's marketing's responsibility.
So I'm just going to jump in here if you don't mind, Jenn. It's interesting because when I hear that, and I'm not picking on you, and I think we'll make it live with two sides of a coin that need to work together, is going into the CRM, you're finding things like sales ops is change the flow. And I'm thinking, sounds like there's a communication issue there, that if you're finding out things by, and I don't want to use the term snooping, but I will for the fun of it.
In my experience, honestly, sales sucks the communication with marketing. In fact, sales often looks at marketing like they're servants, right? Why aren't you giving me my one-pagers? I used to go into companies as a marketing leader and I called it wallpaper sales because they were always whining about one-pagers. So I gave them one-pagers for everything, and then I could go on with my actual job.
It's interesting. I come from a different industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, which is face-to-face calls with physicians and marketing, supplying sales aids and what have you. Interesting, because we talk about lead generation. I ran sales. I was very focused on how do you build your, because in Canada, there's 25,000 physicians.
Mhm.
I'm sure in the US, there's 250,000. So you got to be very targeted as to who you call on, which I guess is
Mhm.
like the leads. And marketing wanted to get their hands on that. I always assumed that was my baby. And we would feed back to marketing who we're targeting and why. And then hopefully there's information that would link to our targeting approach that would be in the marketing pieces.
And there shouldn't be, absolutely. When you're doing an account-based attack, right? You're describing account-based marketing for all intents and purposes, even if we didn't call it that. What you have to do is agree on the criteria for identifying accounts. And so then marketing can start warming up accounts that you haven't had a chance to touch, but they're not the stupid accounts that you would never touch.
Jen, I'm going to go back to the question I asked
Mhm.
earlier. Is you say it's marketing's job to figure out why the leads aren't working versus sales, if I heard you
Yes.
right. So talk to us from that perspective.
The reason I say it's marketing's job is that honestly, sales is such a grind and they're not incentivized to tell marketing. They don't think long term enough to say, if I give marketing this piece of feedback, my leads will be better in 6 freaking months. I mean, 6 months, like my quota's reset at least twice by then, if not 6 times, depending on ideal signs, etc. It is marketing's job to think both short term, and it's not as short term as sales, but both short term and long term. I need to build my brand so that when you walk up to the doctor's office, they're like, oh, we know who you are. Come on in, give us some pens. There's a misaligned incentive for sales to give marketing that feedback, unless you have a truly mature sales leader who has had a good marketing counterpart and says, oh, I know, I give feedback and then I get better leads. But otherwise, unless they've learned that in their career, and we wouldn't be talking about marketing versus sales if it were common to have a great relationship, but it's marketing's job because they're the ones spending the money to get the leads. They're the ones spending the money for the brand presence. The more misaligned you are, the worse everything gets.
Exactly. What's interesting with the conversation about listening to calls, going into the CRM, you can argue all day long, but here's what came to mind. And I knew we were getting ready to have this conversation with this morning is, what gets lost in all of this is the customer. Like, if you really care about the customer, get out of your silos and get next to each other and say, okay, we've got the best product or service. And if we aren't selling to the people that really need us, that is a disservice. So I think we need to get over ourselves a little bit, that this transparency thing, it's about the customer. It's not about sales and marketing.
Yeah, it's why I question, if you're a marketing leader and you don't go to at least 1 or 2 industry conferences, what are you doing? I mean, do we like the floor? Do we love walking the floor? No, nobody likes the floor. However, get on the floor, find out how things are going, talk to the people.
Yes, right, in a rep way. And how many marketing folks do you see that sales leaders always are doing ride-alongs, whether this is Zoom
Mhm.
ride-along or car? How many marketing professionals actually get in the car and go out and accompany salespeople in meetings, in your experience?
Well, it depends. I am largely a MarTech background, so they want the marketing people to do ride-alongs, right? But I will say, when I have not worked in MarTech, it's much harder to do a ride-along, especially for enterprise sales where you do all of the in-person stuff, but you've got to build relationship. And that's why going to industry conferences is huge, is because when you can't do ride-alongs, go to where the people are.
So from my experience, a couple things that worked, because what we're trying to do is help bridge that gap between sales and marketing know they need to work together, but how can we help them? right? How can we help each other? I'm with Colleen, and in Pharma One, we pushed our managers to be out in the field, not only coaching, but seeing customers, but also marketing people had quotas in terms of number of days they needed to spend in the field. And the other thing that we did was we had rep advisory groups for specific products. So when marketing was developing a sales aid or a campaign, we had 2 or 3 reps, many of them when we were across Canada, so they would call in, maybe Zoom in or Skype in those days, but would be part of the process of building any materials. Because what happens is if materials are not built with sales input, sometimes they don't get used. So the advisory groups would be responsible not only for the input, but also helping to sell it to the rest of the team. When we had a sales kickoff meeting, our champions or product champions would be part of that process of introducing the other sales reps to it.
And that makes sense. If you can't ride along with sales, though, and I'm talking, I have mostly a tech background. And so in tech, we've got the customer success team, and they basically take over the accounts. I know that in some industries, the sales owns the entire life cycle of the account. But if you can't get into a ride along in a sales call, you can certainly talk to current customers. And I said conferences, I love that in pharma, they were actually talking to the people who were talking to the customer. And that's what actually sparked me to say, oh yeah, but if they're current customers, you can ride along with customer success much more easily than you can ride along with sales.
Yeah.
And in that industry, do you create support materials for customer success people or just for the sales people?
I think you should create for both. Like, for example, if you're launching a new product feature, the collateral may be the same or it may be different. There's a reason to sell on it. There might be a reason to upsell on it. There's a different spin there. So a good marketing team does, because especially if you're in SaaS or something like that, it's so much easier to keep a customer than win a customer.
So Jenn, we've talked about this sales and marketing, and it's been a conversation forever, hasn't it? So we talked about reducing the friction, communication being one of those. And I noticed on one of your LinkedIn posts that you presented the idea, I think I've got this right, where maybe there needs to be one person that both marketing and sales are reporting to. Maybe it's the CMO is in charge of revenues, the CRO is in charge of revenues, or the CEO. So can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because that might be part of reducing the friction here.
No, actually, you even read the comment section, because I think that's where that idea really got hammered out. So I appreciate that. So the premise of the post is that it almost doesn't matter how much bread marketing and sales break together. It almost doesn't matter if they are in lockstep, no ops problems, total communication, everybody knows the customer. The moment the CEO says to one or the other of them, basically, I'm threatening your job, whose fault is this? It dissolves the lockstep. Because the moment you start threatening somebody's livelihood, you've hit a deeper level than sales and marketing alignment will ever hit.
Right. So now we've got the fight or flight response going on when game starts. All right.
Exactly.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that. In organizations, there's always going to be friction. Depending on how you structure the organization will determine where that friction is going to be. So let me give you 2 examples. I was in an organization where we had dedicated business unit directors or VPs of sales and marketing that were responsible for the whole business unit, versus taking several business units and having dedicated head of sales and dedicated head of marketing.
Mhm.
So in the second structure, the friction was between sales and marketing. In the one where you had business units and you had a person who was responsible for both, the friction was between business units for resources and for recognition.
But this business unit actually worked.
Yes, I've done that job, and that's a fun job actually to do. I guess you're head of sales and you're head of marketing, but both try to get their way with you, but you have an ability to make sure that sales is delivering on what marketing is done because you've ownership.
Especially if you have a go-to-market background. If you have carried a bag, if you have owned a pipeline goal, if you have done this. Now, granted, if you have a sales background, you have to learn the long-term thinking of marketing. If you have a marketing background, you have to learn the grind of sales, right? You have to cross-train. But then it's so different than having that CEO who, with no go-to-market background, being like, whose fault is this? And they can't hear the explanation, versus saying to the go-to-market leader, whose fault is this? And they're like, oh, we have a systems problem here and we have this here and this is how we're fixing it. I mean, very different conversations.
Right. So this is where the CRO and the CMO need to join elbows and sit down with the CEO and share with him or her that there's no one to blame. We're a unified front.
And solving the problem, because
Yeah.
of course, what we're talking about is we've missed quota, we've had a few down cycles. It's a unified problem solving front. It's not like, you suck, you didn't work my leads. It's, hey, we noticed this ops problem. Hey, this thing's happening over here. We need to change our persona target, and we're already working together to fix it.
It's a proactive approach. Yeah.
Yes.
So how many CROs and CMOs get together and meet once a week, twice a month? What's been your experience?
When I was a CMO and I had a CRO who was willing, I would have weekly or biweekly just one-on-ones, or I would have go to market leadership meetings, which also included the head of CS if we were all peers. I couldn't always do it. I didn't always have a CRO who wanted to or was willing to talk to me that often. The marketing becomes the order takers at that point.
Okay. So this is where the CEO could drive that. And the accountability is like we have sales activity plans for sales reps. Well, the activity plans for, and that's kind of a tactical term, but for the CRO and the CRMO is, are you meeting once a week, twice a month? And then that report rolls up with whatever data needs to be measured. So again, it could be bottom up or down.
I've actually worked at organizations where the CEO didn't want the go-to-market leadership to meet separately from the rest of the exec team. And I'm like, really? I was a little speechless because I'm just like, we don't need the head of product or the head of engineering in the room when we're hammering out a lead flow or an account handoff. Like, what?
You know, it's interesting if the CEO has to sort of say, well, you guys need to meet together on a regular basis. It feels like micromanagement to me.
It's an expectation. So the expectation is, it's just like anything else. And so if we expect our reps to make X amount of calls, we expect our sales leaders to run X amount of coaching calls. My expectation, because that's who it's rolling up to, unless there's a layer in between, I believe if that expectation isn't set, it's not going to happen. So I don't think it's micromanaging. I think it's setting expectations for success.
And as part of that, if one of my sales and marketing leaders comes to me and says, I have a problem with that person, the CEO, instead of stepping in, because CEOs tend to be problem solvers and keeping them out of things like that is almost impossible, should be like, okay, fix it. You go figure this out. If you can't figure this out, then we have a much larger problem.
Exactly. I think it's a much simpler solution, but it goes down to, do we believe the CRO and the CMO should be meeting? Do they believe it's worth the time to meet? Are we hiring collaborative people versus silo people? There's probably a whole bunch of conversation behind that. Stephen, I'm curious, what's your big takeaway from our conversation today? There's probably many.
I'd like to do one thing before, because it's been sitting here. I haven't asked Jen the big question, our signature question, in terms of what has been your leadership awakening moment. It's part of our journey. What sort of awakened you that things are different than you anticipated?
So I became an executive really young in technology. I used to run IT departments at law firms. I had to fire the first person I ever hired. He was like hiding my invoices from me, like crazy things. And then the second person I hired ended up working for me for 5 years. And it was because I had this revelation. And at first I was frustrated because I'm a big picture problem solver. I get stuff done. And he's a box checker. And for every new user, he would print off the new user sheet and check every freaking box. And I was like, what are you doing? And then I realized that because he carefully went through lists, he saved us so much money and time in some things that I would have just skipped over because I don't follow directions well. So many leaders. That's me. And so I realized, and it's the mantra, I even quoted this to a new leader yesterday. I said, people do things differently from me, and that's good. And what's interesting is, as we've been sitting here talking, and I'm glad you asked this question at the end instead of the beginning, is that is probably why I'm like, what does sales need to do? And so who cares more and needs to do what to fix it? Because sales does things differently than marketing, and that's good.
Nice way to bring it back. Thank you. That's a thoughtful response. So in terms of walkaways, there obviously continue to be challenges between sales and marketing. And we've got a wonderful approach, which is very simple. It's called listen to your counterparts, hear what they're saying, and see how you can best align and understand each other's objectives so they're actually joint objectives and you can work better together. Colleen, do you have one walkaway that you'd like to share?
I think what I found intriguing, and Jen, this was even after our first conversation with you, is really encouraging more people in those important marketing roles to listen to the calls, because you're going to hear it with a whole different set of ears. And part of that could be in sales, we can get very attached to the quota. That's never a good thing, by the way. That's a whole other conversation. But because we're attached to the quota, we might not be doing the deep listening. You're listening for another reason. So you could be hearing things that even a very good salesperson isn't hearing because you're coming from another perspective. It doesn't mean that you don't have to hit the quota. So I love the fact of listening. And then I think it's also, be okay if somebody wants to dive into the CRM, because after all, if we're people of integrity, you have nothing to hide.
Thankfully, I've never had a sales leader say, get out of my CRM.
Yeah, again, you're looking at it with a different set of eyes and ears. And
Yeah.
I always think that's just, we all talk
Mhm.
about, gosh, if you have these diverse teams, they're the best until it comes time to, wait a minute, I don't want you looking at my stuff.
Yeah, there are takeaways. There are other things. Like I have listened to calls for difficult accounts and occasionally have been like, hey, when they ask this question, you answered that. I actually think they're getting at this. And I've had sales reps say, you gave me an excuse to send an email and you're right. And thank goodness. And I've had sales reps say, yeah, I get that. I did that already. But that different perspective can sometimes help some stuck deals too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jen, thank you so much for being our out of the box guest today, coming from that marketing perspective. And I think we have a much better idea that there's really no one to blame, but lots of problems to solve. So for all of you that are listening today, thanks for joining us at the Sales Leadership Awakening podcast, where we do our very best to help you bridge the knowing and doing gap as sales leaders. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.